The Galactic Council chamber was vast, adorned with banners of 1,000 empires, each symbolizing species that had once dared to defy the Council, before being crushed beneath its might. And yet, as Commander Elias Vance stood before them, his presence radiating an eerie calm, an unsettling realization crept into the minds of the assembled alien dignitaries. For the first time in history, it was the Council that felt small. "Let me make this clear," Vance said, his voice steady, dangerous. "Humanity came here for peace. You mistook our patience for submission. That was your first mistake." He leaned forward, gaze like a sharpened blade. "Your second?" His lips curled into a smirk. "Thinking you could survive us." Then, in front of billions watching across the galaxy, the humans walked away, and the universe would never be the same. The council chamber was filled with a dull hum of murmuring voices, the gathered dignitaries barely paying attention to the human delegation seated at the central podium. Some whispered among themselves, others exchanged sly glances, as if the outcome of these negotiations was already decided. To them, this was just another formality, one they had overseen countless times before. Commander Elias Vance sat motionless, eyes sharp, jaw tight. He had played this game long enough. 7 months. 7 months of endless posturing, backhanded proposals, and thinly veiled threats. Humanity had been patient. Too patient. The Supreme Arbiter, an ancient and withered being with a leathery exoskeleton and dark, pitiless eyes, finally leaned forward. His voice, smooth and measured, dripped with condescension. "Commander Vance, your concerns have been noted." He folded his clawed fingers together, as if speaking to a naive child. "But understand that these measures are necessary for galactic stability. The terms have already been approved by the Council. Your government would be wise to accept them." Vance glanced down at the data slate before him, the proposed treaty glaring back at him like a loaded gun pointed at Earth's head. Military oversight. Trade sanctions. Expansion restrictions. They were demanding submission, not peace. Vance exhaled slowly, placing the slate down. He looked up, meeting the Arbiter's gaze with something that made the elder alien hesitate. A flicker of something unsettling. Something dangerous. "I'd like to clarify something," Vance said, voice cool, calculated. "You expect us to sign away our military autonomy. You will oversee our trade. You will dictate how and where we expand." "That is correct," the Arbiter said with a knowing smirk. "It is the standard protocol for all new members of the Council." Vance let the words settle. The other Council members watched him, waiting for the inevitable submission. That was how this worked. A species made the mistake of thinking they could negotiate as equals, and eventually, they would break. They always broke. "Not today." Vance straightened in his seat. "And if we refuse?" A ripple went through the chamber. The question itself was unacceptable. Refusal wasn't an option. The Arbiter's smirk widened. "Then the consequences would be unfortunate." Vance held his gaze. "Be specific." A low chuckle passed through the gathered officials, some amused, others outright mocking. The Arbiter leaned back in his seat, his spindly fingers tapping against the podium. "Your colonies would find themselves isolated. Supplies would become scarce. Trade lanes would close. Those unwilling to comply would suffer. Earth would suffer." Vance's expression didn't change. He just listened, absorbing every word. A new voice joined the discussion, a guttural, growling tone filled with smug superiority. Counselor Vokran of the Zorvath Dominion, a reptilian brute, heavily armored in ceremonial warplate, his slit-pupil eyes glowing with malice. "Your species is young," Vokran sneered. "You do not understand the weight of the galactic order. Every race before you has bent the knee. Do you think yourselves special?" Vance smiled. "Special?" he said, tone almost amused. "No. Just different." The smirk on Vokran's face twitched. The commander turned his gaze back to the Arbiter, slow and deliberate. "You're trying to intimidate us into compliance." Vance leaned forward slightly. "That's your mistake." The Arbiter's expression hardened. "Your only alternative is annihilation." Vance let the silence stretch between them. He took a breath. Then, slowly, he reached for the earpiece embedded in his collar and activated a private, encrypted frequency. Burn it! A single phrase. Across the galaxy, human diplomats, scientists, and envoys, every single representative, in council-controlled space, stood up simultaneously and walked out. Entire embassies emptied in seconds. Trade hubs were abandoned overnight. Every single human asset across council worlds vanished. The Arbiter tilted his head, as if sensing something had changed. Then, Vance's voice came again, measured, deliberate, final. Negotiations are over. The massive chamber erupted in chaos. Council members jumped from their seats, voices overlapping in frantic outbursts. Some shouted protests, others demanded an immediate response. Even Vokran looked momentarily stunned. The Arbiter's smug demeanor shattered. "What have you done?" he hissed. Vance stood, adjusting his uniform, completely unbothered by the storm of panic around him. His voice was calm, too calm. "We came here for peace," he said, almost as if reminiscing. "We were willing to compromise. Work with you. Build something that would benefit everyone." He turned his back to the podium, making his way toward the exit, every step slow, deliberate. His final words echoed through the grand chamber, drowning out the clamor of the council. "You mistook our patience for weakness. That was your first mistake." He paused at the threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. "Your second?" A slow, predatory smile crossed his lips. "Thinking we need you more than you need us." And then he was gone. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The councilors looked at each other, searching for answers in the growing unease that spread like a sickness through the assembly. Then, emergency beacons began flashing. One after another, distress signals lit up across the holographic galactic map in front of them. Trade routes blacklisted. Supply chains disrupted. Entire colonies lost contact overnight. The council scrambled, issuing immediate orders to tighten the embargo, to mobilize fleets. But something else was happening. The communications officer at the chamber's control panel went rigid, staring at the incoming data streams, his skin draining of color. His fingers trembled over the controls. "Supreme Arbiter," he whispered, barely able to form words. The old alien turned, expression darkening. "Speak." The officer swallowed, voice shaky. It's the Zorvith Dominion fleet. They've lost contact with 2 dreadnoughts stationed at the human border." The chamber went dead silent. Vokran's eyes narrowed, his armored claws gripping the edge of his seat. "Lost contact? How?" The officer shook his head, sweating now. "No distress beacons. No transmissions. Just gone." Another warning beacon flashed red. "Outer Rim Logistics Hub Omega-4, offline." A third. "Council Supply Convoy G-17, lost." The Arbiter's expression twisted in horror as realization set in. This wasn't retaliation. It was erasure. The Galactic Council had just made its worst mistake. And it was already too late to stop what was coming. The council chamber was in disarray, voices raised in panic as the reports kept coming. The Supreme Arbiter's claws tapped against the data console, his usual composure cracking. Something was wrong. Something beyond the council's understanding. Humanity had not retaliated. They had simply disappeared. And now, the galaxy was bleeding. Vokran's deep, guttural snarl cut through the chaos. "I demand to know what is happening." His massive form loomed over the table, armored fists clenched. "Where are my warships?" The communications officer hesitated. His throat bobbed, sweat beading on his forehead. We don't know. 2 dreadnoughts missing? No distress signals. No wreckage." He swallowed. "It's like they were erased." A hush fell over the chamber. "Impossible," the Arbiter muttered, shaking his head. "Nothing simply disappears." Another alarm. Another report. "Outer Rim Logistics Hub Omega-4 has gone dark." A second voice, from across the chamber, eyes wide in disbelief. Council Supply Convoy G-17, gone. No beacons. No survivors. Silence. Then, one by one, the transmission signals began cutting out. The counselors froze. A cold, creeping dread settled in the chamber. Humanity wasn't attacking. They were eliminating. Vokran's claws dug into the table. This is sabotage. This is terrorism. He turned sharply to the Arbiter. You were a fool to let them walk away. We should have crushed them before they had the chance to. Silence. The Arbiter's voice trembled, his usual arrogance replaced with uncertainty. His dark eyes locked onto the reports, scanning them with a growing sense of unease. The Council had always assumed control was absolute. That no species could function without its oversight. Yet humanity had simply left. And now, the galaxy itself seemed to be fracturing around them. A third warning signal flared across the holographic display. The chamber doors burst open as a security officer rushed inside, breathless, eyes darting wildly. The Terrans, he gasped. They've shut down the primary hyperspace lanes. The Arbiter's gaze snapped toward him. What? Our fastest routes. The main conduits for supplies, trade, and fleet mobilization. They're gone. Disabled. Every navigational beacon along the major trade arteries has gone offline. The Arbiter's mind raced. The implications were horrifying. The Council's strength wasn't just military, it was logistics. Control. Order. Infrastructure. If humanity had found a way to sever their routes. A final signal interrupted his thoughts. The room dimmed as an emergency broadcast forced itself onto the Council's main screen. A face appeared. Vance. Calm. Unshaken. Waiting. The chamber was dead silent as his voice cut through the tension like a knife. Let me guess, he mused, head tilting slightly, as if mildly amused. You thought we'd come back begging. No one spoke. No one moved. Vance's eyes scanned the counselors, one by one. We knew how this would go before we ever sat down at that table. Your negotiations were never meant to be fair. You don't deal in diplomacy. You deal in control. His voice lowered, dangerous now. But there's one thing you never understood about us. The chamber flickered as new data flooded the display. Council supply worlds under siege. High command stations going dark. Entire planets severed from communication. The Arbiter stiffened, his claws gripping the console so tightly the metal groaned. Vance's voice was unrelenting. We're not like the others you've conquered. The screen split into multiple feeds, Terran warships appearing from the void, striking hard and fast. Ghost fleets moving in ways the Council couldn't predict. Targets vanishing before they could even react. Vokran slammed his fists onto the table. This is war. Vance chuckled, and for the first time, something cold and lethal crept into his expression. No. This is a warning. The screen flickered again. More losses. More destruction. We could have fought you head-on. We could have met your fleets in open war. You would have bled us, made it costly. But that's not how you fight a tyrant, is it? The chamber was deathly still. You strip them bare. Vance's eyes gleamed with something ruthless, something absolute. You cut their supply lines. You isolate them. You make them irrelevant. Another display flashed, a Council-controlled species defecting to humanity's side. Then another. And another. Entire factions were abandoning the Council. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Arbiter's throat went dry. What do you want? Vance's expression didn't change. Want? A soft exhale, almost a laugh. You really don't get it, do you? He leaned closer to the screen, eyes sharp as steel. We don't want anything from you. The chamber felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of those words. We were willing to talk, Vance continued. To build something real. Something better. But you didn't want peace. His voice dropped lower, a deadly whisper. So now? You get to watch. The screen shifted one last time, to the Council's own homeworld. Their great capital city, the heart of their empire. Surrounded. Terran warships loomed above it, countless in number. Silent. Unmoving. Waiting. Panic erupted in the chamber. Some counselors tried issuing orders. Others demanded retaliation. But there were no ships left to mobilize. Vance sat back, relaxed. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said smoothly. "You'll fight. You'll scramble. You'll try to hold on to what little power you have left." His smile was almost pitying. "And then, when you realize it's over, you'll come to us." The Arbiter shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. You wouldn't." Vance's eyes locked onto his. "Wouldn't what?" Another feed appeared, a high-ranking Council fleet commander, surrendering. Vance didn't blink. "We don't have to fight you." The room darkened as more and more signals blinked out. "We just have to make you irrelevant." The transmission cut off. And in the silence that followed, the Great Galactic Council, the ruling body that had controlled the stars for millennia, finally understood what true fear felt like. For the first time in history, humanity had simply left them behind. The council chamber was suffocating under the weight of failure. Every screen flickered with warnings. Every line of communication crackled with chaos. Reports flooded in from every sector, supply chains collapsing, border fleets abandoning their posts, planetary governors defecting one by one. The Galactic Council was unraveling. The Supreme Arbiter stood motionless, hands gripping the edges of his podium. He had ruled over the Galactic Order for nearly a century, dictating the fates of countless species. But now, for the first time in his long reign, he felt something he had never known before. Dread. "Where is the Terran fleet now?" His voice was tight, barely controlled. The communications officer hesitated before responding, his voice trembling. "They're warships. They're everywhere, Supreme Arbiter." His throat bobbed. "And nowhere." Vokran's patience snapped. "What in the void does that mean?" The reptilian warlord's fangs bared, his armored fist slamming into the table. "Speak plainly before I crush your skull." The officer swallowed hard. "They aren't engaging in open battle. They're appearing in uncharted systems, disrupting hyperspace routes, intercepting convoys, then," he exhaled sharply, "vanishing again before our forces can retaliate." Another counselor, a high-ranking admiral, stood abruptly. "They're waging asymmetrical war against us." His voice was hollow, the realization setting in. "They aren't trying to win a direct fight. They're dismantling the foundation of our rule." The Arbiter's hands tightened. "We have a standing military force 10 times the size of the human fleet. This should not be happening." Vokran sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Then let me deploy my warriors. We will hunt them down one by one and gut them for their insolence." The Arbiter barely acknowledged him. His mind was spinning, calculating. The strategy was becoming clear now. The humans had walked away from peace talks not in defeat, but in preparation. Every move since then had been precise, calculated, relentless. They had never planned to fight the Council head-on. They had planned to render it obsolete. A new warning flashed across the room. The counselors turned to the screen as a live transmission came through. A frantic governor appeared on the display, his feline features drenched in sweat. Behind him, sirens blared. "They've come!" he gasped. "The humans there!" A dull explosion. The transmission cut off. Another message appeared. Then another. And another. Planetary governments collapsing. Entire sectors falling to an invisible force. The Arbiter's throat went dry. "Where is Vance?" The communications officer hesitated before pressing a control. The chamber lights dimmed. A new transmission came through. Vance's face filled the screen. He sat in the command seat of a Terran warship, the glow of strategic overlays reflecting off his cold, unreadable expression. Behind him, his officers moved with calm precision, carrying out a war of annihilation without ever firing a single superweapon. Silence stretched between them. Then Vance exhaled softly. "So," he said, almost lazily, "how's that embargo working out for you?" The chamber erupted in noise. Shouts of outrage, demands for surrender, threats. Vokran lunged forward, snarling. You dare! Vance didn't even blink. I dare! His voice cut through the noise like a blade. The counselors fell silent. You thought you could squeeze us into submission. Thought you could starve us, isolate us, break us. His head tilted slightly, the barest hint of amusement flickering across his features. Didn't quite go the way you planned, did it? The Arbiter's fingers twitched. He forced his voice to remain steady. We are willing to reconsider the terms. Vance chuckled, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? The screen flickered again, shifting to live footage from the Council's own capital world. Terran warships hung in the sky. Silent. Watching. The chamber froze. The Arbiter's breath caught in his throat. This was not a direct assault. The humans had not fired a single devastating planetary weapon. They hadn't needed to. Terror swept through the council members as realization dawned. Their rule was already over. Vance leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You had your chance. Another flicker on the screen, a high-ranking fleet admiral, one of the council's own, kneeling before a Terran officer, surrendering his forces. One by one, the council's strongest military leaders were switching sides. The Arbiter's grip faltered. His mind whirled. No war had ever been fought like this. No species had ever unraveled the council without a direct military conquest. This was something different. This was extinction without fire. His voice came out barely above a whisper. What do you want? Vance's eyes were cold, unfeeling. Want? A slow, deliberate smile curled his lips. We don't want anything from you. The Arbiter felt his stomach twist. We were willing to talk, Vance continued. To build something new. To bring balance to a system that's been rotting for centuries. But you weren't interested in peace. His voice lowered. So now? You get to watch. The chamber flickered with more surrender reports. Entire fleets going dark. Governors switching allegiance. The council's own people abandoning them. A long silence stretched before Vance spoke again, his voice eerily calm. The Terran fleet is leaving your capital untouched. For now. The councilors barely breathed. Vance's final words sent a chill through the chamber. We don't have to kill you. The room darkened as more signals winked out. We just have to make you irrelevant. And then, the transmission cut off. The chamber sat in stunned silence. The councilors looked to the Arbiter. For the first time in history, he had no answers. The Great Galactic Council, the ruling body that had dominated the stars for thousands of years, had just become a footnote in humanity's story. And they hadn't even seen the war begin. The chamber was silent. Not the silence of peace, nor the silence of contemplation, the silence of something dying. The Galactic Council, the ruling body that had held dominion over the stars for thousands of years, sat frozen, watching their empire collapse in real time. The Supreme Arbiter stood still, his mind racing. The humans hadn't invaded. They hadn't unleashed planetary devastation or mass bombardments. They had simply made the Council irrelevant. His fingers trembled as he turned toward his advisors. How many fleets do we still control? A communications officer, pale and sweating, shook his head. We don't know. We've lost contact with over half our regional commanders. Some have defected. Some, he swallowed hard. Some have simply gone dark. Vokran slammed his fist onto the table, his voice a guttural snarl. Enough of this. I am activating the Dominion fleet. The humans want war? We will show them more. The Arbiter turned sharply. You don't understand. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. His eyes locked onto Vokran's with something far worse than anger. Understanding. They already won. Vokran's lip curled in disgust. You would surrender? The Arbiter exhaled slowly. This was never a war. His gaze drifted toward the main holographic display, where sector after sector blinked red, indicating collapse. We ruled through control, through economic strangleholds, fleet dominance, and information control. He gestured to the screen. And now? Every major trade hub was either occupied, destroyed, or turned against them. Supply lines? Dismantled. Communications networks? Crippled. Entire military installations? Abandoned before a single Terran soldier set foot inside. They dismantled us, the Arbiter said, voice hollow. And we never even saw it coming. The chamber dimmed. Another emergency broadcast. The screen flickered to life. Vance. His face was calm, his posture relaxed, his eyes as sharp as ever. He leaned back in his chair, watching them with the patience of a predator that already had its jaws around the throat of its prey. You're out of time, he said, voice steady. Your fleets are leaderless. Your governors are defecting. Your supply chains are gone. The counselors sat frozen, every breath shallow. You don't get it, do you? Vance continued, shaking his head. You thought we'd come here begging. That we'd play your little game until we had no choice but to kneel. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something absolute. We don't kneel. The Arbiter's throat felt dry. What do you want? Vance studied him for a moment before answering. Nothing. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Another screen activated. Live footage from the capital world. Terran warships filled the sky. Not firing. Not attacking. Just waiting. Vance's voice was almost a whisper now. We could have burned your cities to the ground. We could have glassed your planets, erased your people, made you beg for mercy. He leaned forward. But we didn't. Silence. Because we don't need to. Another alert. A fleet deactivating their weapons systems. Another. And another. The counselors watched in horror as entire armadas surrendered without a fight. Vance's voice never wavered. Your fleets are powerful. Your armies are vast. But they fight for credits, for obligation, for fear of punishment. He exhaled. Ours fight for home. The Arbiter gripped the table. You would dismantle the Council? Leave the galaxy in chaos? Vance's smile was cold. You think we need a council? He gestured to the screen. Look at them. Look at your own people. They don't need you. His voice lowered. They never did. The Arbiter looked to his advisors. Some sat with blank expressions, others with growing despair. No one argued. No one objected. Because it was over. Vance's final words were delivered with chilling finality. You ruled through fear. And today, you learned what happens when that fear dies. The transmission cut out. The chamber remained silent. One by one, the counselors began to stand. Not in defiance. In resignation. Their time was over. And humanity had never needed their approval to begin with. The chamber was heavy with silence, the weight of inevitability pressing down on the remaining counselors. Some still clung to their pride, others to denial, but most sat with the vacant look of men who had seen the foundation of their power crumble beneath them. There was no more shouting, no more anger. Only quiet despair. The Supreme Arbiter exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the table. We have ruled the stars for thousands of years. His voice was steady, but hollow. We believed our dominion was eternal. His gaze drifted toward the central holographic display, where the latest reports continued to roll in. More surrenders. More defections. More silence from systems that once answered only to the Council. His fingers curled into a fist. And now? A long pause. No one spoke. Finally, one of the older counselors leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Now we are nothing. Vokran let out a low, guttural growl, shaking his head in fury. This cannot be the end. The humans. He bared his fangs, his claws scraping against the table. We still have fleets, still have warriors. We can regroup. We can strike back. The Arbiter didn't even look at him. And what would that accomplish? Vokran snarled. They humiliated us. We cannot allow this. The Arbiter's voice cut through the chamber, quiet but firm. The war is over. Vokran rose from his seat, armored shoulders heaving. Then we burn them. He spat. If they think they can erase us, then we take the entire galaxy down with us. The Arbiter turned his eyes toward him for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, no desperation. Just acceptance. You don't understand, do you? Vulcarin's lip curled. Enlighten me. The Arbiter gestured to the screen. The Terran fleet still hung over the capital world, unmoving, waiting. If they wanted to destroy us, we would already be dead. Vulcarin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They did not come for war. The Arbiter continued. They came to end us. And they succeeded. He leaned back in his chair. The Terrans dismantled our power without firing a single planetary weapon. They collapsed our rule without needing to topple a single government. He shook his head slowly. They didn't conquer us, Counselor. His voice was barely a whisper now. They made us irrelevant. Vulcarin's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. His claws flexed, his fury desperate now, hollow. Then we strike before we fade. The Arbiter sighed. And if they simply refused to fight? The question settled over the chamber like a death knell. One of the other counselors, an amphibian with dark, reflective eyes, finally spoke. They have already left the council. We no longer have power over them. His voice was measured, but it trembled at the edges. Even if we declared war, who would fight it? Vulcarin's head snapped toward him. Our fleets are dissolving, the counselor interrupted. Our admirals are defecting. Our officers are abandoning their posts. Our soldiers are surrendering to nothing because there is nothing left to fight for. He looked down, his webbed fingers tapping absently against the surface of the table. The truth is, they do not fear us anymore. His voice grew distant. Because they do not need us anymore. The words lingered in the air. The Arbiter's gaze was distant now, his mind drifting across the centuries. He had presided over wars, over the rise and fall of entire civilizations. But this was something different. The Terrans had not just overthrown the Council. They had made the galaxy realize the Council was obsolete. A quiet chime echoed through the chamber. Another transmission. Vance's face filled the screen once more. His expression had not changed. I imagine this is the part where you ask for a second round of negotiations. No one spoke. Vance's gaze swept across them, his head tilting slightly. Nothing to say? No threats? No demands? The Arbiter studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. What happens now? Vance gave a slow, almost amused exhale. That's the best part, he said, leaning forward slightly. Nothing. The chamber stilled. You will wake up tomorrow, Vance continued, his voice even, measured. And you will look out at the stars, and realize that no one is listening to you anymore. A flicker of something cold passed through his gaze. Your allies have abandoned you. Your fleets have no one to fight for. The species you once ruled have chosen their own paths. He leaned back in his chair. And you? You're just men in a room. Vulcarin's teeth clenched. You will regret this. Vance's smile was infuriatingly calm. Will we? Vulcarin's claws dug into the table. You think you can hold this galaxy together without us? You think the Terrans can keep order? Vance actually laughed. Who said anything about order? The room fell silent again. Vance's smile faded, his voice turning cold. You thought this was about replacing you. It wasn't. This was about showing the galaxy it never needed you in the first place. The Arbiter's shoulders slumped. Then what do we do? His voice was low. What do we become? Vance studied him, his expression unreadable. That's up to you. The Terran commander exhaled, stretching his fingers. You can cling to the scraps of your power, pretend this is just a temporary setback, maybe convince yourselves that one day you'll rebuild. His voice remained indifferent. Or you can step aside, let the galaxy move forward, and become something else. His head tilted slightly. Something better. The Arbiter swallowed hard. And if we resist? Vance's smile returned, but it was not kind. Then you will fade into history. He tapped the console. The connection cut out. The chamber was left in perfect silence. For a long time, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, one by one, the counselors began to stand. Not to fight. Not to declare war. But to leave. And as the Supreme Arbiter sat alone, staring at the blank screen where Vance's face had been, he finally understood. The Terrans had not conquered them. They had ended them. And the most terrifying part? They never even looked back.